next item then is the talk of the month, and that will be by Dr. John Barentine, talking about preserving dark skies from the top down. John is an Arizona native who received his PhD in astronomy from the University of Texas, and then he joined the International Dark Sky Association, but there was a 5-year interval between getting his PhD and joining IDA, in which he had a staff position at Apache Point Observatory in New Mexico, in which he actually did real astronomy there. He joined the staff of IDA and had various positions and became the director of public policy there. John left IDA just about a year ago, I believe it was, to form Dark Sky Consulting, which offers services ranging from lighting strategies to dark sky preservation to certification assistance for the IDA Dark Places program, which John actually ran for a number of years at IDA. When he's not preserving dark skies, John pursues his interest in the history of astronomy and is the author of 3 books on this topic. So tonight, we'll turn it over to John with his perspective on the very intriguing idea of preserving dark skies from the top down. John?
Thank you, Don. I appreciate that introduction and the invitation to come speak to the group tonight. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get my slides up and running. So hopefully everybody can see my title slide. And in the next about 30 minutes, I'm going to make an argument and hope to convince you that there is another way that we can come about the subject of preserving dark skies. It's a bit different from the way that it's typically done, and how we might go about doing that, and really the reasons why we should. So I'm going to do this by framing it in 4 questions. And first is just a little bit of a review. A lot of you already know this, but it's good to hear it again every now and then. It's why we do this, why do we care, and what is it that we do? What's the sort of current model of protecting dark skies, especially here in the United States in our particular legal system? But I'll argue to you that the status quo isn't working. It does work on the micro level with some individual municipalities, but if we talk about larger scale, regional, national kinds of trends, that it's ultimately an inefficient process, and that eventually we're going to have to turn this around and start working at progressively higher levels in order to create the change that we want to see. How can we go about this differently? What are some other ideas, other approaches that we could take? And finally, why I think is now the time to do this. So I'm going to start with just a brief, big picture overview of why we care about the subject and what are we currently doing about it. We care about this for a number of reasons. And, again, I know you all know this, but it's good to be reminded periodically. We have just fundamentally changed the geography of our Earth at night. This is the famous NASA black marble composite image that you can also see as my Zoom background here, that was made over the course of about a year, mid last decade, from a year's worth of satellite observations. So it is as if the world is simultaneously clear everywhere, and we can see the lights of the Earth. And the continents are pretty well outlined. Where there's not a lot of artificial light, moonlight is responsible for bringing out the continents against the darker oceans. We see a lot in images like this, a lot about the settlement patterns of humanity, some about the land uses, et cetera. But the really striking thing is all of this light is a relatively recent arrival. It wasn't here. If you look back a little more than a century, the Earth would not have looked anything like this at night. So we're really changing our planet in a distinct way that has consequences associated with it. And that moves some of us to want to do something about it. We also care about it because of all of these consequences that affect the places that we live. It's not an abstract environmental problem. It's not something in another part of the world that we don't have to think about. It's happening in the places where we live right now, today. And whether that is issues with public safety associated with outdoor lighting, or the energy use to power all of the lighting that's producing the waste, the sky glow in this image, to the extent that that links up with energy security and climate change. Of course, it has an impact on wildlife, on human health and well-being, perhaps. So it's a lot more than just astronomy, even though I think that's how a lot of us come into this topic. But it's become a quality of life issue. And I know that that's important in a place like Flagstaff, whereas people in other parts of the country and of the world aren't even thinking about it yet in the sense of it being quality of life. So we care about this because it's already affecting the places that we live. And at the end of the day, it's something that is separating us from part of what I think is just intrinsic about what it is to be human. There was a time when every human being on the planet had access to a night sky that looked something like this. That was true of people living in cities as in rural areas. And again, the transformation of our planet at night has only really come about in little more than a century. And all of that long history of our relationship as humans with the night and the night sky, and how that has inspired us to discover, to research, to create great works of art, et cetera, is really something that we grew up with as a species, and increasingly we are cut off from that. So a lot of us see images more like this, and we want to do something about that. We would rather have night skies that look a little bit more like this. So how do we typically go about trying to change things? I think it falls along these three broad avenues that have some overlap with each other. We educate, we advocate, and hopefully, if all goes well, we legislate. And we still have to make people aware of this issue. A lot of people don't know about it yet, or they've never given it much thought. So we have to make them aware that there's a problem. We then have to show that there are solutions to it. We have to give good arguments for why it should be different, why we want a different outcome. And then finally, we have to convince the people in the halls of power to hopefully do something about it and codify it into law, because for a lot of reasons, we think that's the best way to express what the desire of society is, or aspire to a certain kind of condition in our society, that we really need to write durable rules where everybody understands what the rules are, and there's some system for hopefully holding people accountable to that. So that's typically the way this is done, especially here in the United States. It's very locally focused. We tend to make lighting policy through local land use codes in particular. There's not a lot of regulation at higher levels of government. It's very locally focused, and that's been most of the story to date. So what do we hope happens as a result of those actions? We'll gradually raise awareness to the point that people begin to think that there's a problem here to be solved, and they want to see a different outcome. Along the way, we develop better policies, better lighting practices. And if we can get enough people to go along with this, and we can write some of these ideas into law, we should see gradually improving nighttime conditions. And there's a little bit of evidence for that in certain places, again, usually on a very local scale. And that's good, of course. We're getting good outcomes in certain places, but we're not getting out ahead of the problem in a broader sense. So why isn't, as I would submit, the status quo working particularly well? Well, for one thing, you might have noticed that we live in a fairly turbulent political time. And rather than the sense of we can rally everybody around an idea that really has broad appeal and brings people into this movement, it usually works like this. People divide into their respective camps on practically every issue. We don't see past the fact that we have a difference of opinion with somebody else, and it's hard to make progress in a world like that. There is a tendency to cast this as us versus them. As much as we try to persuade and bring people along voluntarily in a way that doesn't entail beating people over the head with policies that they don't really want. We have to persuade, we have to have some sense of compromise, and we have to bring people along. But we just live in a time when it's pretty difficult to achieve that for reasons that have nothing to do with lighting or with light pollution. This follows what has been described as the issue attention cycle. I went back and found the original paper where this was originally described in the early 1970s and pulled the figure out of the paper here. This is a model for how society interacts with issues and how you go from framing the problem to discovering solutions to hopefully bringing enough people along on the idea that there's a problem to be solved. They demand that change of their lawmakers take action. And then you kind of roll down the other side of the hill in the latter stages of the cycle. You start to find maybe there are shortcomings in the way that you dealt with the initial problem, and you reset to a new level somewhere. And sometimes this is shown as a circle, because it really is a cycle, and the output of one pass through the cycle is the input to the next. And a lot of times it feels like we're sort of perpetually stuck in stage 2, the discovery or enthusiasm stage, or we're climbing what I call the hill of discovery. Yes, a lot of people are still finding out about light pollution and dark skies. And in many cases, they're supportive of our goals if they can get up, up that hill a ways. But it seems like we never quite reach the crest of the hill. We haven't quite achieved the critical mass that we would need. Again, we can do it on local levels, but getting this done over larger jurisdictions, the levels of states or countries, is fairly difficult. But this is kind of the model that I always keep in the back of my mind of how things should progress if we're sort of following the way things normally go. And we've seen this play out in other realms of environmental policy here in the United States. So why don't we get up to the top of the hill, and why do we have trouble getting over that and reaching the critical mass? Some of it is, quite frankly, that sense of polarization that I talked about earlier. A lot of people that I've encountered have a fear of the dark, even rational adults. But it's a lot more than that. These are all different objections that I've heard people raise here in the US about why they can't sign on to some of the ideas that we have that we think would benefit them and would make the sky maybe a little darker at night. Some of these are sort of more cultural than anything. Some of them are highly political. But I would also submit that there's something else that's going on here too. And it's more than the sum total of all of these typical objections that we hear from people. But that doesn't mean that we cannot overcome that, I think, at the same time. I think with the problem with the way we do things now is that it just aims too small. And I think of organized efforts that are above the level of individual cities. So, your group, for example, focuses on Flagstaff and its environment. IDA has chapters that focus on states, or larger territories. And then we work with some organizations in other countries that try to deal with even larger territories. The focus, especially here in the US, is really on the grassroots. It's very local. There's a lot of grass to maintain, is one way of putting it. There's a lot of grass to keep watered and maintain relationships. There are over 80,000 municipalities in the United States. And if we were to go one by one, by the time we got even through a fraction of that, we would start to have issues with the ones that we had already managed to condense. I also feel like this very local approach to regulation just ends up being whack-a-mole. So in a city more like where I live in Tucson, where we have a bigger population, we have more suburbs, we have other municipalities that are on our boundaries. Even though we do things pretty well here in Tucson by medium American city size standards, if the town or, the next one over past the boundary doesn't, then we have to deal with their problems because light pollution doesn't respect any jurisdictional boundaries. So in that sense, it's like air or water pollution. And if we took a city by city approach to dealing with those kinds of environmental pollution, I don't think we would have achieved the results that we have in the roughly half century since the modern environmental movement began in the United States. And at the same time, we live in a world that is changing, a world that I would characterize as being both tired and restless. We're tired of all the issues that we're asked to care about. Issue fatigue is very real. I sometimes feel like even among environmental issues, light pollution just completely gets lost in the noise. and that it's rapidly being swamped by, to the extent that there is concern for climate change by that topic. As I mentioned, the sense of polarization and the just social mistrust among groups in our society are really significant, but not impossible obstacles. And I wonder sometimes whether our experience with the pandemic has kind of changed the landscape a little bit. For example, I'm hearing from people I know that work in astro-tourism that they're expecting that as the pandemic recedes or takes a different shape, that more people are going to be getting back out there and they're going to want to engage in new and interesting and unconventional forms of tourism. And that might actually drive more people to go see dark places. And I wonder if it has also maybe changed what people value a little bit. It's caused them to rethink the things that they might have previously thought were important. And that could work for or against us. If people start to care more about the world, for example, about the environment, that might be an opening for us. But if they kind of close ranks and it comes back to the sense of me, putting me, my family first, et cetera, they might not be as open to these ideas. That is a part of the story that is yet to be written, but I'm hopeful nevertheless. And a lot of people in advocacy don't like me saying things like this, but we win some battles, but we are losing the war terribly. If you look at a global scale, this is probably the most complex technical part of the presentation, which is a figure some of you people probably have seen that came from a paper that Chris Kaiba and his coworkers in Germany published about 5 years ago, using satellite data from 5 years previous to that. So we're now looking at sort of the beginning of the last decade. And they asked of the countries of the world, how are they changing in terms of the area of lighting on the ground? What fraction of their territory is lit? And how much light is there? If you add up all the light, what's the total? And so those are the left and the right panels here, respectively. And for each country, it's coded in colors according to the change during the study period. And the warmer colors mean larger change. You might see repeated in the media sometimes that the world is getting brighter at about roughly 2% per year, which is true if you average it over the world. But there are a number of countries where it's changing double digits per year. So, you look at the United States and we've slowed a bit, at least we were slowing. This was right at the outset of the LED revolution. And it's possible that the apparent near zero change in the United States was not due to actual patterns of light usage, but had more to do with the equipment on board the satellite that didn't see the light emissions as we were converting to LED, because it's relatively insensitive to the blue light that they produce. So likely the United States did get brighter during this time, but it's really looking at the rest of the world and seeing that there's just so much upward positive pressure here is what's going on. So how can we go about this differently? This is the second half of the talk. This is my proposal for ways that we might approach this from the top down that might actually work. And we would have to set a couple of goals. And one of those goals is to convince people in positions of power that unnecessary light is a source of pollution that should be subject to reasonable controls. So this is more what parts of the United States looked like maybe 60, 70 years ago, post-war, a lot of industrial production, a lot of air pollution. We would all agree, I think now, knowing what we do know about air pollution, that this is an unacceptable picture, right? That we want a world that doesn't look like this. And so we put into place things like the Clean Air Act that really fundamentally transformed the air quality in the United States. And we had to get to the point where we agreed that this kind of pollution was a detriment to the environment and to people, and we should do something about it. So that's the first goal, is to convince people in power the same way that they, we all see the smoke coming out of the stacks and we know that this is pollution, that they would view unnecessary light at night, terrible installations that are running all night long and are benefiting nobody. We think of it in the same way. So that's the goal. How could we go about doing this practically at the national level? We have existing environmental laws that address this to some extent. For example, there's something called the National Environmental Policy Act, that should be not protection, but Policy Act of 1969, that obligates the federal government, at least, and states have their own equivalents of this, but it obligates the federal government to take into consideration the impact to the environment from its activities in the planning process, and where there are opportunities to mitigate those harms, that it proactively take those steps. The NEPA Act also established the Council on Environmental Quality, whose director reports to the President of the United States and is tasked with implementing NEPA. And so you can see that this NEPA process diagram on the left shows all of these inputs that goes into the process. And the result of that may be an order that a certain element of a federal project has to be carried out differently in order to reduce the influence on the environment. NEPA right now does not formally consider light pollution. It's not in the regulations. Some people find NEPA at its edges could deal with something like light pollution. It is being implemented in certain federal agencies like the Department of the Interior, through the National Park Service, for example. They have applied NEPA review to lighting installations where there are light pollution concerns. So this is one way we could approach it, is to leverage the environmental laws we already have. Some other countries have done this, most notably Mexico recently passed national legislation into law that adds to its existing equivalent of NEPA in Mexico an obligation to apply it to light pollution that will, in the next few years, begin trickling down through to the local governments through a set of rules that its equivalent of the EPA is going to write. So this is one way we might go about it. But maybe we need to go a little bit further, and perhaps we need legislation that's very particular to light pollution. An example that I like to use is the Clean Air Act, as I mentioned earlier, with the example about air pollution. And to give you a sense of what Clean Air Act did, there are two pictures of the New York City skyline taken about 60 years apart before and after the Clean Air Act was passed into law in 1970. And you can see that the change in the skyline is night and day. Anybody who was around that long ago will remember that American cities had terribly dirty air, places like LA, Chicago, in the 1950s and 60s. And after Clean Air Act came into force, things changed dramatically. So this is an example. It's a model for what this might look like. And I show the graph on the right that plots the change in different air pollutants, which are all but for the purple curve. And you see, 10 years on after the enactment of clean air, everybody was trending downward, basically. We're still a little flat with ozone. That hasn't improved a lot, but other more visible air pollutants have decreased significantly. The one trace that's going up is US GDP during the same period of time. So it's hard to argue that there's something about the Clean Air Act or the other major pieces of environmental legislation that were damaging to the US economy, because our economy has grown essentially throughout, with the exception of a couple of incidences, mostly the Great Recession in the late 2000s. But it doesn't look like these sorts of policies have had a detrimental effect to the economy, but they have definitely benefited the well-being of the environment and also improved the health of Americans as well. So I have publicly called for what I call the Clean Night Skies Act, and that would be modeled very much on something like the Clean Air Act or Clean Water Act, where Congress would essentially declare that under certain circumstances, artificial light at night is an environmental pollutant, and it would task the EPA with setting thresholds, and the EPA would be able to levy fines against cities that didn't meet them. I have presented this in other fora, and I've been told that this is very heavy-handed, this is impossible, Congress would never do this. And if you go back to some of the environmental debates that were happening in the late 1960s and early 1970s, for a while there, it also seemed that the power of industry and economic concerns was going to ensure that Congress would never pass the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act. But they prevailed in the end. And I don't think it's crazy to believe that we might have something similar to this within another generation. And the key to doing that is keeping up the pressure on people in Congress to get them to recognize the nature of the environmental threat, and then to come in behind it with the proposed solution and say, we want to leverage the kind of environmental policy that the United States already has to deal with this problem. So another goal or way we could go about this is to work on regional or maybe state level lighting plans, something that has a regional characteristic to it, where we start to draw in the different municipalities, counties, conservation districts, et cetera. And we have a plan for how we're going to manage the growth of light over time. There's a model in this, which is obviously important here in Arizona, and that's how we protect our water, which has become even more important considering that we're going through the most intense and prolonged drought in more than 1,000 years right now. And we have done this in part by establishing water conservation districts across the state that begin with the watershed map on the left. So we say, all right, here are the sources of groundwater. We match these up with various government jurisdictions in the state, and we come up with these conservation districts. And they know sort of what the flow of water in and the flow out is. They know how many people live there. They create more local policies around water usage in order to try to balance the need against the supply and make sure that we have water into the future. And I think something like this could work on a regional level, where we say, we're going to put something like a cap on top of the light emission in a region. So if you want more light over here on this side, you're going to have to take something down over here on the other side. It's sort of similar to things like cap and trade that have been proposed for reducing carbon emissions. And you could even talk about a cap and trade system or something comparable to that, an excise tax, something of that nature for light that might have a similar effect. And we could do it with a fair amount of local control if we approached it this way. So how might we do this practically? So we take a page from something that's called Viewshed Protection. And if you've ever been to a national park and talked to a park ranger, they can tell you a lot about viewsheds. And it's the idea that there's a region on the ground where if an observer is standing in a particular location, they can see everything along the line of sight from their position. And that's illustrated at upper left, where the viewshed is everything that those red lines basically intersect. So you don't see what's on the far side of the hills, you see the near side. And if you have an elevation map for a region, you can produce a viewshed map like the one on the right. So the viewsheds just define the contents of an observer's visual environment. So what does this have to do with light pollution? If we invert the idea of the viewshed, if we turn it on its head, and instead we ask for a given location on the ground, where does the light come from that ends up in its night sky, and then in turn ends up as part of what's illuminating the ground at night? This is some work by my colleagues Salvador Barra and Raul Lima in Europe, who looked at a region in northwest Spain called Galicia. And in this example from their 2018 paper, they invert satellite data, which is shown on the left. That's a black and white satellite map of Spain and part of Portugal at night. And they looked at this area around a town called Aveiga in Galicia. And then the map on the right shows, after they inverted this, this is sort of the light shed, if you will, of Aveiga. And all of the districts and regions that are on that color-coded map are contributing light at the zenith in Aveiga based on the brightness that they light up with there. So the yellow and the red and the orange counties and districts are contributing more light in that town than the ones that are in blue, for example. So instead of putting a city at the center of that, if we said there's a protected area over here, we do this inverted light shed analysis that they've proposed, we can then figure out where are the regions that are surrounding that place that are contributing the light. They call this photons without borders, which I thought was pretty clever. So this is one way that we might approach this idea of a viewshed for light. And the way we could start with that here in Arizona is just by matching up our light at night map, which is the false colors in the background, with what are the major planning organizations within the state. And you can see that, you know, Phoenix lines up pretty well with the Maricopa Association of Governments, like we have an Association of Governments here in Pima County. And start at that level and then start breaking it up and implement some of these ideas if we can bring enough of the stakeholders in each of those regions on board. And try this out. We need to test out whether it works and find out if it works well, so that we can then have some case studies that we can export to other places. So in the last couple of minutes here, I'm going to make an argument for why I think the time that we should do this is now, that we shouldn't wait for another generation to go by. The case for policy change is really strong. There's a lot of attention to this issue right now. These are a sample of headlines on the right from some major world news sources. In just the last couple of years, people are thinking about this more than they ever have. We have a better handle on the science now than we ever have. Quick plug for a report that I just authored for the International Dark Sky Association called State of the Science 2022. It's available on the IDA website, and I put a little shortened URL right there if you want to download and read it. We've distilled the science of artificial light at night and light pollution down to about 6 pages in what I hope is accessible language. And this is the kind of thing that you can just slide right across the desk to your favorite legislator and say, here's all the evidence backing our claims and the kind of policy changes that we want. The solutions to the problem are simple, they're fair, they're cost effective. We have a high confidence that they work, and that all we have to do is make the decision to implement them. And if we do, we know what the results will be. So what we just have to do is build up the public desire for a better outcome. And it's something that really in the end doesn't disadvantage anybody. And so I wonder, to close, as a throwback to just before the major environmental policy changes of the very late 1960s and early 70s, I wonder sometimes whether we will have a river on fire moment. And for those of you that were around, if you think back to the summer of 1969, the Cuyahoga River that runs through Cleveland famously caught fire because of the amount of industrial waste that was in the river. And it turns out that this had been happening with some frequency for almost 30 years at that point. And the locals just stopped paying attention to it because it was so frequent. It was just part of the landscape. So I think about this in the same way that people aren't concerned about sky glow over their city, or they're not concerned about light that's having a negative impact on their urban wildlife. But an outsider who looked at that might be shocked. And the reason that the world saw this was because on this particular day in June of 1969, there was a photographer from Life magazine on the scene, and they ran a photo spread later that year. And Americans were horrified by the notion that their rivers were so polluted that they could catch fire. I think we will eventually have that moment with light pollution. It may not be quite as dramatic as this, but we'll experience that moment when the public's opinion on this suddenly lurches forward. We suddenly climb to the top of that hill of discovery, and we reach critical mass where enough Americans say, okay, we're ready for this to be different. We'd like some change now. We come in behind it with the solutions. We have ideas for what the legislation is, or how we might set up these regional conservation districts. And I hope we will turn the problem on its head and look at a more potentially top-down solution in the future. So that's all I have. I'll leave up my contact information for a moment. Happy to discuss this further with you tonight or offline if you would like to. So thanks for your attention, and happy to take any questions you may have.
Hi, this is Barry. I've got a couple of comments on your presentation. One is top-down is nationally, so that means Congress. And if you look at the past 4 or 5 years with Trump, he's systematically torn apart the EPA. Congress is going to have to prove. I think they're going to see more regulation. And what is this going to cost? So I think there's real obstacles with politically. Next step down is the states, and I'm not sure how that's going to fly. I think there's similar issues, and I think practically the best way to approach this is the way we're doing it now through cities, like the city of Flagstaff. But I'd be interested in seeing how you're going to tackle these problems and what strategies you think will work, given the current political climate?
Barry, those are absolutely valid questions, and I'm glad that you asked them. It's a little, there's a little bit of idealism in this. You might have noticed. I'm well aware of the many challenges that we face. Top down is not only at the national level, but as you said, it's also state level, or maybe regionally. As an example, with the water conservation example that I showed with the watersheds, I didn't show the other Western states that are part of the Colorado River Compact, for example. So that's an avenue that we really haven't even explored, is could more than one state form some sort of political alliance to address the question? That's a possibility. It's going to take time. It's going to take money. I am no Pollyanna about that. It's going to take money. It's going to take lobbying. We are planting seeds already. Myself, people who belong to IDA and others have been talking to congressional staff behind the scenes. The thing that we want to try as an experiment first is to find a sponsor for a non-binding resolution in the U.S. House that would just express support generally for the idea without committing anybody to anything yet. The reason that I think this can work even in our divided political climate is that 2 sessions ago in the Utah legislature, now we're talking about one of the reddest states in America, a legislator from Washington County, Utah, which is sometimes described as the reddest county in America, submitted a resolution, non-binding resolution, to the Utah State Assembly calling on Utahns to educate themselves about light pollution, take steps voluntarily at their homes and businesses, et cetera, to reduce light pollution. And it passed overwhelmingly in both chambers of legislature, and Governor Herbert signed it into law, as much of a law as it is. I think we can overcome these divisions. I think it might turn out at some level to be less controversial than we think. And it's going to take time and effort and money, most importantly. If we can marshal those resources, I think we can do this.
Thank you for your presentation. Excellent.
Thank you.
John, I'd like to make a comment. That's an excellent presentation. Thank you so much. I would like to point out that I think, and I think this is probably the way you're thinking of as well, that we need both sides of this problem. I think we need increased emphasis on the top down, but I think the bottom up part has to be there as well, is sort of the smaller communities, and there's 80,000 of them. We'll never get through that thicket if that's how we're going to solve the global problem. But locally, we have to have, we can view them as test beds that help us to establish what is the nature of the problem, what are the natures of the solution, what works and what doesn't work. So that when you start talking about the top-down structures that you need to create, you can know what is effective and what is not effective.
Yes, prove
For
it.
example, an awful lot of the top-down stuff that we have been seeing over the years, decades really, has been very, I won't try to find really political words to say it, it's been very wishy-washy and aspirational, but not binding. So it's establishing, that we care about the night and that we don't want people to waste light and they should use as warm as possible. But then that's as far as it goes, and it doesn't actually produce any results because it's not specific enough. And it's not demonstrated to people who are making these laws from the top that it's known not to be effective before you started. When they start these, they often think all we need to do is pass these rules. That's what everybody tells us, and then things will get better. And as you've pointed out, they're not getting better. So we really need these test beds, I think, to demonstrate what the field of play is, what's practical, what's not, to help this problem go forward. And I would point out that illustration you gave, that great one of the Cuyahoga fire, it happened again and again, and nothing really happened until that light photographer put it in the national press. And nobody in the national legislatures or state legislatures is going to do anything about any problem unless they feel that it's a problem people care about. So we have to work from the bottom up as well to demonstrate that it's something that's important.
Yes, and don't get me wrong, I didn't mean to suggest that we toss out the grassroots model at all, because it's working in certain places. And as you said, it's providing us with those examples that we're building up. If we want to get even to that regional conservation plan, and whether that's Northern Arizona or we're talking about piloting something around here in Tucson, we have to have examples at sort of from the very fundamentals on up, where you take an action, here's a result. We make changes to our streetlights here in Tucson, and this is what we go measure, so that we can show that it's building up progressively from that micro level to get to that intermediate level. If we can show that, it then becomes harder for people to say at progressively higher levels, oh, we shouldn't try that because it won't work. So no, I think these work really in tandem. It's just that there's so much emphasis now on the local level that not very many people are thinking about this from the top-down perspective. And I'm arguing to put at least some of our efforts into that, even though it's a longer-term project, and it may be decades before it's realized, but you got to start somewhere. And again, taking a page out of the environmental movement in the United States, people were campaigning about pollution as early as about the 1940s or so, and it was a solid 30 years really before they started to see the fruit of their labor. So yeah, I think it's going to be both of those things that get us there.
I wanted to, if people will let me share, I want to share the Cuyahoga on fire picture. Can I do that? I don't know if you can see this picture here, this pair of pictures on our webpage. Does it show?
Yeah.
Yes.
So we see the same part of the sky on the left, taken outside of Flagstaff, Arizona, and on the right, same part of the sky. You can hardly tell, but it's in the Phoenix metropolitan area. That's the Cuyahoga is on fire. See that triangle? That's the summer triangle, the red triangle. And here's the summer triangle in the dark sky. That's the Cuyahoga is on fire. The problem is nobody realizes that this isn't inevitable. They've been looking at the Cuyahoga burn every couple of weeks or couple of years for 30 years, and they don't realize that it doesn't need to be that way. So that's part of, here's the Cuyahoga on fire. What we need is convince people that it doesn't need to be that way. It's not inevitable. Thank you. That's all.
What
Hi, can you
about
guys hear me?
pursuing the energy angle? It takes fossil fuels to generate electricity, to generate all the lights. And that's very costly right now. So cities and states could save money by cutting back on the lighting some. Individuals could save money. We'd have more stuff to export to Europe or whatever. It just seems like this would be a timely time for that.
Anne, if this was 10 or 15 years ago, I would have agreed with you enthusiastically. And the reason that it's harder for me to do that now is because lighting has become so energy efficient. And as much as LED could save the world, it's kind of going in the opposite direction, because it's encouraged people to overconsume something simply because it has been made cheap. I gave a presentation earlier today to the Utah Office of Energy Development, and they were kind of shocked to hear me say that your claims about LED may not be right. And they said, well, what do you mean about that? And I said, okay, well, we all agree that LED takes less electricity to produce the same amount of light. Okay, yes. And I said, so that means that it's getting progressively cheaper to generate light. Okay, well, what happens, at least here in the West, what happens when the price of something goes down? Do we consume less of it, or do we consume more of it? Well, we consume more of it, almost everything. And the consequence is that it's undercutting the claims that have been made about LED as being good for the environment. So that's the ironic way. You may actually be right. Because at first I thought, well, if all of the lighting is becoming very energy efficient, then for us to argue that reducing the light was going to reduce the energy consumption, reduce the climate change impact, it would be less of a claim at that point. But if it turns out, and there is some evidence for this, if it turns out that the world took the energy savings from LED and they just turned around and put more light out there into the world, and we see some evidence for this, now we have an energy argument again. So when I talk to groups like the Energy Office in Utah, my point is, we're not opposed to LED necessarily, but not if it comes at the price of something else bad. So we're doing good by reducing our energy dependence, reducing our energy consumption. But if we're creating a different environmental problem over here, then it's not worth it. And anyways, all of these things that you think are true about LED might not be true after all. So I think you are right in a roundabout way that we should still be making the energy argument, but we have to convince people not to use light simply because it's inexpensive to use it. And that's a big challenge.
I have been tracking my energy usage for 20 or 30 years. I've been living in my house here. I have a spreadsheet, and I've typed in all the information from my electric bill, how much energy use. I put comments on the side saying what changes I made when I changed to LED lighting. I could see stuff go down. But come Christmas time, when I would put on those LED lights for 1 or 2 weeks a year, my energy levels would just spike. It was just so obvious that it was the, super efficient LED Christmas lights. So I know that it does use a lot of energy. It doubles, more than doubles my energy usage for that month.
A lot. It's not infrequent. It wasn't rare in the past, but it seems more frequent today to drive by parking lots in the daytime that are fully illuminated. And I say, there is that LED up there wasting energy efficiently.
Yes.
Yeah. And that was true in Fox Glen Park, too. The Astronomical Society had our picnic there in the afternoon, and you could see the light was on. And
they don't seem to care. I go there, the natural grocers in town, an environmentally sensitive corporation, you might think. Their lights, their nice amber LED lights, are on in the daytime, and I go in and I tell them, and nobody really, and they don't know who turns them on or who turns them off. But like John says, they're using so little energy apparently that nobody is motivated to solve the problem. Yeah, but you could still save, half of your energy bill, if you have them off during the daytime.
And we should pursue that for the same reason. We should, in addition to promote LED as an energy saving device, but come in behind and say you also need to get rid of the lighting that's not doing anything. You need to turn lighting off when no one is using it. The same things that we have been saying, even when lighting required a lot more energy to power, those are still valid ways to reduce energy consumption, even if the lighting is efficient. So what I tell people, especially in municipal government, is, hey, great, glad you converted over to LED. You need to dim lights or turn them off overnight. You're just going to save more electricity and more dollars.
So I would like to call everyone's attention to an article that I think Drew also mentioned that was in the Atlantic Monthly yesterday. And I think it'll be their lead article for next month. And I think this particular article is going to have a tremendous amount of influence. And it's about the effects of light pollution and noise pollution on wildlife and insect populations globally. And there are a lot of people that really care about this kind of thing. And it's a very, really great summary of this problem. And it lays it out beautifully. And so I just see this kind of thing building all the time. And if you haven't seen that article, it's in this month's Atlantic, and I think the author is Ed Young. And I would really call your attention to it.
Yeah, I'm from New York City. Whenever they turn the lights on, there are lots of dead birds.
John put the link into the chat.
I was just going to mention.
It's a great story.
Yeah, John, when you're talking about energy use and the increase in efficiency, when I speak specifically about energy to groups, I oftentimes reference, I'm sure you're familiar with two papers, Tsao and Wade in 2010 on the world's appetite for light, and then Fouquet and Pearson, 7 Centuries of Energy Services. Both of those demonstrate unambiguously that even starting at the time from the Fouquet and Pearson start out with rush lights, which are reeds soaked in grease, that from that up to today, every time there's been an increase in efficiency and therefore light getting cheaper, we've never used less energy, we've never spent less money. We've eaten up that entire gain in efficiency by making more light. That's happened for 7 centuries now, and I don't see any reason why we'd expect this iteration to be any different. It definitely points out that it's something that people need to keep an eye out for, and not just assume that we're going to use all that increased efficiency by not using less, or by using less energy. So because it's never happened before, and that's historical. So I find both of those kind of compelling things to share with people because they're interesting studies.
I think this has been a very stimulating conversation, John. I thank you again so much for your time and that presentation and the inspiration. And I hope that we maintain some idealism in this whole movement in this day and age so that we can still get up in the morning and push back against the light. So thank you so much for your time.